They tried to bury this story, not in books, not in silence, but in time itself, hoping that if enough years passed, the memory would dissolve into dust. But time has a way of keeping its own records. It stores the things we fear, the choices we regret, and the legacies we refuse to acknowledge. Somewhere in the folds of American history lies a family whose name has nearly vanished, erased from maps, journals, and local memory. Yet their shadow lingers. It's whispered in the hills, in the abandoned houses no one wants to enter, in the archives that smell of mildew and old ink. What happened to this family is not the story of crime or scandal. It's the story of silence. A silence so deliberate, so suffocating, that it shaped generations. You can still feel it in the air if you go there. The sense that something terrible once lived and died on that land. Old photographs show faces too solemn for their age, children staring at the camera with the stillness of people who have already learned to keep secrets. This is not a tale of ghosts, yet it haunts like one. The events are real, documented, recorded in the margins of forgotten county ledgers and half-burned letters. A family that once stood as a symbol of pride and progress turned inward, consumed by its own pursuit of perfection. Wealth gave way to obsession, and obsession to decay. They built walls, both of stone and of blood, closing themselves off from the very world they once helped shape. Generations later, when researchers unearthed the remnants of their estate, they found not relics of success, but artifacts of fear, locks on every door, rooms sealed from the inside, journals that ended mid-sentence. The evidence spoke of a slow unraveling, a descent that no one dared name aloud. What you are about to hear is the story of that descent, of a family that mirrored the rise and fall of America itself. Ambitious, proud, and unrelenting until something darker took hold. This is the secret that was never meant to surface, a truth so disturbing that even those who uncovered it refused to publish what they found. Tonight, we open the door they tried to keep closed. This is America's darkest family secret, finally exposed. The story begins as most tragedies do, with ambition. In the early years of the new nation, when land meant power and power meant immortality, one family rose from obscurity to prominence almost overnight. They came from the heart of Virginia, a name once spoken with respect, even reverence. They were builders, traders, politicians, pioneers of their time. To outsiders, they were the embodiment of the American dream. But beneath that polished veneer, something darker was taking root. The patriarch, a man of immense intelligence and unshakable pride, believed his bloodline was destined to last forever. He saw the world as fragile, corrupt, and undeserving of his legacy. So he built his walls higher. He began to speak not of community or progress, but of purity, of keeping the family name untainted. What began as pride evolved into an obsession, an inherited belief that the family's greatness could only be preserved through itself. At first, it was only whispered. Marriages between distant cousins, kept quiet but not entirely hidden. The town pretended not to notice, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear. But over time, as the family withdrew further into their estate, their lineage folded in upon itself. Children were born with eyes too pale, voices too quiet, as if even their bodies were learning the language of secrecy. Their once grand house became a fortress of whispers, every room echoing with the sounds of a lineage trying to preserve itself at any cost. Visitors spoke of the eerie silence in the halls, the way the portraits on the walls seemed to follow you, each generation resembling the last with unnatural precision. By the late 1800s, rumors began to spread. The townsfolk spoke in cautious tones about strange lights in the windows, about family members who were never seen again after certain winters. The few who entered the property came back changed, shaken, pale, unwilling to speak of what they'd found. But the most disturbing discovery came decades later, when historians began to piece together the fragments of their letters and journals. There, between the lines, were confessions, half-written admissions of what the family had done to itself in the name of preservation. It wasn't madness that destroyed them. It was purpose, a twisted belief that their blood was sacred, that their story was divine. What they became in pursuit of that ideal is what turns this from history into nightmare. When the 20th century arrived, most families adapted, evolved, or vanished quietly into the current of modern life. But not this one. They remained, rooted to their land like the trees that surrounded their decaying estate. While electricity lit up nearby towns and radios filled homes with laughter, their property remained silent, flickering only with candlelight. They called it tradition, but those who dared to look closer saw something else entirely, a refusal to let the outside world contaminate what they believed was pure. By now, the children rarely attended school. Records show that their births were documented inconsistently, sometimes under false names, sometimes not at all. Census takers reported fewer people on the property each decade, though the smoke from the chimneys never ceased. It was as if the house itself was devouring them, consuming its own history to feed the illusion of survival. And yet the strangest thing is this: their photographs never disappeared. Local newspapers, fascinated by the mystery, occasionally published an image, black and white portraits showing faces eerily similar across generations, the same angular features, the same hollow eyes. Time didn't seem to touch them. The resemblance was too precise, too unnatural. Scientists who later analyzed surviving photos noted how difficult it was to tell one generation from another. It was as though the family had stopped evolving altogether, trapped in a genetic echo chamber that defied the rules of nature. Neighbors remembered the sounds at night, the low hum of chanting, the creak of doors opening when no one was there. The older residents of the nearby town warned their children never to wander near the estate after dark. Some said the family performed rituals not out of malice, but desperation. They believed something was slipping away, a force, a purity, a divine right. And so they clung tighter to what they had left. But the more they tried to protect their lineage, the more it seemed to turn against them. Illness began to creep in, slow and silent. The children grew weaker. The men, once proud and commanding, started to vanish before middle age. Doctors called it genetic collapse. The family called it fate. And through it all they stayed silent, bound by a code written not in words, but in blood. Every empire falls. But when it happens behind locked doors, without witnesses, the fall becomes something far more haunting. It becomes legend, buried, denied, and waiting to be uncovered. Decades passed before anyone dared to step onto the property again. By then, the world had changed. Modernity had reached even the quietest corners of America. But there were always places progress could not touch, places where time refused to move forward. The estate was one of them. In 1961, a team of genealogists and local historians arrived, hoping to document the lineage that had once shaped the region. What they found was not history. It was something closer to a warning. The air inside the house felt heavy, damp with decades of silence. Dust clung to everything, yet some rooms looked as though they had been left only moments before. Beds neatly made, candles burned halfway down, journals stacked on desks, as if waiting to be read. It was a home preserved in decay, trapped between life and death. They began their search in the family archives, a small room hidden behind a false wall. Inside were boxes of letters, medical notes, and photographs that no one outside the family was ever meant to see. At first glance, it seemed like a record of ordinary life, births, marriages, deaths. But as the researchers read deeper, a pattern emerged. Every name repeated. Every spouse shared a surname. Every illness mirrored the last. The documents revealed not one family line but a closed loop, a cycle that had spun in silence for over a century. And then came the medical records, pages filled with notations in the patriarch's own hand, tracking bloodlines like a scientist studying his own experiment. He wrote of genetic purity, of maintaining strength through selection, of what he called the preservation of essence. But essence became obsession, and obsession became decline. The final pages were scrawled desperate and nearly illegible, references to the weakening, to the punishment of the body for the arrogance of the blood. These were not the words of a rational man. They were the writings of someone who had stared too long into the mirror of his own creation. By the time the research team left the property, they had collected enough evidence to rewrite local history. But they didn't. The report was sealed, archived under government order, citing privacy and potential unrest. Only fragments remain today, scattered in university collections and local museums. The rest was buried again, exactly as the family would have wanted. But the truth has a way of finding light, no matter how deep it's buried. What haunts most about this story is not what they did, but why they did it. The patriarch's writings suggest he truly believed he was saving his family, preserving something sacred against a world he saw as corrupt and decaying. But generation after generation, that salvation became their cage. The family's isolation warped their perception of love, duty, and belonging until blood itself was the only bond that mattered. They married not for affection but for obligation. They had children not for life, but for legacy. And over time, the human soul began to thin out of the picture entirely. What remained were shells, people living in the shadow of an idea too heavy to carry and too terrifying to abandon. When outsiders finally began piecing together the truth, what they found wasn't just genetic decline, it was psychological inheritance. Each generation carried not only the family's physical traits but its unspoken dread. Diaries describe children hearing whispers in the halls at night, voices telling them to stay within, protect the name. Whether those voices were real or born from the family's collective guilt, no one can say. But the result was the same, an unbroken chain of fear disguised as tradition. The more they obeyed it, the more it consumed them. And that's where the true darkness lies, not in science, not in sickness, but in belief. When human beings convince themselves that their suffering serves a higher purpose, they can endure almost anything, even their own extinction. Historians studying this family noted how calm their final letters were. No panic, no rebellion, just quiet acceptance. It's as if they understood that their end was inevitable, and in some twisted way deserved. The few survivors who left the estate never spoke publicly. Some changed their names. Others vanished altogether. But the legacy they left behind remains in fragments, old documents, scattered photographs, and the unshakable feeling that something unnatural happened on that land. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you walk away, or would you protect the secret, even if it destroyed you? Because for this family, the choice was never really theirs. It was made long before they were born. Years after the estate was abandoned for good, the land itself began to change. Locals claimed the soil was strange, too soft in some places, too dry in others, as if it was rejecting what had been buried there. Animals avoided it, birds flew wide around it. The house, left to rot, remained eerily intact, as if refusing to collapse completely, its spine held together by secrets it still carried. Some say that even now, if you walk through those woods at dusk, you can hear echoes of voices. A family still repeating its old vows, trapped in the ritual of their own making. Of course, people dismiss these as ghost stories, but not everyone. In the early 2000s, a group of anthropologists revisited the site. They had heard whispers about the family's unexplained genetics, and they wanted proof. What they found was beyond explanation. DNA samples from old belongings, hairbrushes, clothing, preserved medical slides, showed anomalies that didn't align with any recorded patterns. It wasn't just inbreeding, it was mutation. Some sequences were so degraded that computers flagged them as errors, while others seemed to repeat in unnatural symmetry, like the genetic code itself was mirroring. One scientist described it as a spiral folding in on itself. Whatever that means, it left more questions than answers. They published only a portion of their findings, omitting the most disturbing parts. But among the unpublished notes was a theory that the family had reached a point where nature could no longer correct itself. Generations of self-containment had turned their DNA into something no longer fully human, not in the monstrous sense, but in the fragile, crumbling one. Their bodies were no longer adapting, they were remembering. Repeating the past physically, cell by cell, generation after generation. There's a photograph found near the end of the investigation. Grainy black and white, likely from the 1930s. It shows three figures standing in a doorway, all looking directly at the camera. Their faces are nearly identical, down to the smallest detail. At first glance, you might think it's a trick of exposure, a double print. But it's not. They were real, living mirrors of one another. It's easy to think of horror as something external, monsters, ghosts, things that stalk in the dark. But sometimes the most terrifying monsters are made by human hands, and in this case, by human will. When the last surviving member of the family died, there was no funeral, no obituary, no one claimed the body. The name, once a mark of power and prestige, disappeared from every record but a few archival notes. The house was finally demolished in the 1980s, though locals say the bulldozers kept breaking down as if the land refused to let go. Today, a few broken stones and the faint outline of a foundation are all that remain. And yet, for those who visit, there is still a strange feeling, a heaviness that clings to the air, as though something unseen watches from the tree line. Historians now call it a cautionary tale, but that's too simple. What happened to this family wasn't a myth, or a curse, or even madness. It was belief, unyielding, unchallenged belief. A conviction so strong it consumed every generation that followed. They didn't need an enemy, they became their own. And perhaps that's why this story feels so unsettling even now. Because it isn't just about them, it's about us. About what happens when pride turns inward, when fear becomes tradition, and when the desire for perfection blinds us to the cost of being human. You can destroy a house, but you can't bury what it stood for. The echoes of that lineage linger quietly in the soil, in the names forgotten, in the patterns that repeat themselves across history. Every nation has its dark inheritance, stories that refuse to die, no matter how hard we try to silence them. This was America's. Sometimes when the wind moves through those hills, it carries something faint, a whisper, a tone, a breath that sounds almost like memory. It's not enough to frighten, but enough to remind. A reminder that the line between preservation and destruction is thinner than anyone wants to believe. We like to think that time heals everything, that progress erases the old ghosts. But the truth is, time doesn't heal. It hides, it coverweights, and when the silence grows deep enough, the past begins to speak again. So if you ever find yourself wandering through those woods and the air feels heavy, don't listen too closely. Some stories were never meant to be remembered, and some secrets should have stayed buried forever.